Hey, everybody, this is Dr. John Schinnerer back with another episode of the Evolved Caveman podcast. Today, we're talking about one of my favorite subjects, sex. Not the clickbait version, not the locker room myths, and definitely not the Hollywood rom-com lied to you version. We're talking about what the actual science says about desire, connection, intimacy, and why so many smart, well-intentioned, high-functioning people feel confused, frustrated, or quietly broken in this area of life. My guest today is Dr. Justin Garcia, Executive Director of the Kinsey Institute, one of the most respected research institutions in the world studying human sexuality, relationships, and behavior. He has a new book coming out this month, The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love. Dr. Garcia studies how biology, culture, attachment, stress, and modern life collide in our bedrooms and in our relationships. And what he brings to the table isn't opinion, ideology, or hot takes, it's data. So this is one of those episodes that might make you rethink a few things you've always assumed were, quote, just the way it is. So if you've ever wondered if something's wrong with me, or is it just the story I was handed by my friends in high school and that's just wrong, you're in the right place. So let's get into it. Justin, thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm so honored. I'm thrilled. We have so much we get to talk about.
Oh, and briefly, the book comes out this month. Is that correct?
Yeah, January 27th in the US and February 12th in the UK. So
thank you. I didn't have that date, so I just wanted to put that out there. So let's get into it. I wanted to ask you, what's the biggest misconception the public still has about human sexuality that the research has clearly debunked, but culture just refuses to let go of?
Oh gosh, if I have to pick just one, that's going to be tough. I think there's a lot.
Give me three.
Yeah, there's a lot. And particularly around sexuality, there's so much mythology around it. And a lot of that mythology is because there's an absence of data. There's an absence of evidence. And we come up with stories and ideas about what's normal or what's typical. And maybe that's a good one to start with, this idea of what's normal. One of the really interesting things about human sexuality, and I say this as an evolutionary biologist, I study variation and diversity of traits by training. That's what we do as evolutionists, is that sexuality is remarkably diverse and it responds to ecology, it responds to relationships. So one question we hear all the time, Dr. Kinsey heard it in the 1930s and 40s when he was studying sexuality, is this question of, am I normal? And I think it's, if it's consensual, if it's not dangerous, if it's, there's a whole lot that we can consider quote unquote normal. And it's actually not a term I use that often because it's so laden with ideology and with thoughts about what you should or shouldn't be doing. Turns out there's a lot of variation in the natural world. There's a lot of variation in different cultures. There's a lot of variation in different points in time. That to me is so important and at times startling because we think that we should be having sex particular ways, in particular positions, at particular times of day, a particular amount of time. But when you look at the data, what you see is it's all over the map. It is all over the map in what people are doing and when they're doing it and why they're doing it and with who they're doing it. The consistent part is that it's so often couched in these relationship dynamics. That's what was one of my goals with this book, was playing with that tension. But the actual behaviors are really diverse across places. Sometimes it's generations. I mean, sex researchers sometimes talk about the oral sex, for instance, as the hierarchical reordering of oral sex. And what I mean by that is for people today, particularly for young people, oral sex often happens early in a relationship. It's a more casual behavior. Just a few decades ago, oral sex was considered more intimate. You would often have oral sex after you had already had intercourse, after you were in a committed relationship. Not today, it's viewed as almost more casual. It often happens before intercourse event. So that's a shift that happened in the West in just the last few decades. So all these ideas we have, they're often fleeting. They kind of come and go. That's a big one for me.
Well, thank you for that answer. What has surprised you most since becoming executive director, or something that challenged even your assumptions about sex or intimacy or human connection?
Yeah, one of the great things about being at the Kinsey Institute is the way we're structured is really to be a multidisciplinary research center studying sexuality and relationships. So I can run up and down the hall here. We're on the Indiana University campus.
Do you do that?
I do sometimes. My colleagues will tell you sometimes we had a study years ago that as a great example, we had a study that we looked at a national sample of married people, and we found 34.4% had said they weren't touched enough by their romantic partner. And I remember I walked out of my office one day and I went to my colleague Amanda Gesselman, who's next door. I said, "Is this like we have like a touch crisis going on? A third of people are starved." And the running joke was like, "Has he walked in your office yet talking about the touch crisis?" I was up and down the hallway.
Because I would talk about it. I've talked about it for, I don't know, a decade, that we live in a touch-deprived society.
Yeah, you're right.
And I work mostly with men. And so I remember when I had an office, now I work virtually, I thought about how can I touch my male clients on the way in that would, kind of calm their physiology, but is an appropriate way to do it. And I settled on the back of the shoulder. Yeah. So when they come in, I would just say, "Hey, how you doing?" I would just kind of pat them gently on the shoulder because, I mean, I remember there was a study some years ago that looked at how many times during an hour will people touch one another in different cultures over a cup of coffee. And I think if I remember this correctly, the UK it was 0. In the US it was 2, hello and goodbye. And in Puerto Rico it was something like 127. But I think that gives you a good range of just, wow, how, and touch is a basic, as you've written, touch is a basic human need of ours. And it does a lot of good for us. And we just don't touch each other. And it's sad to think that a third of people in marriages are not getting touched enough.
Yeah. And you're right. We're a social mammal that we engaged in licking and grooming, and touching was as part of our deep evolutionary story. And it's still really important to us. It's how you connect. And there have been all these social psychological studies, like how, and I think it's great, this idea of like touching with a client too, in a way that's comfortable. And I love how you do it, that even touching during conflict, or when it can just bring the temperature down, and like when couples are disagreeing, or sometimes you do just need a hug. You need that sort of feeling of connecting to another person. So the great thing at Kinsey is we have all these expertise in the hall, and we have psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, physicians, and we all bring our own disciplines and theories to study sexuality and relationships. So I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot just being here, because the goal was not to create a discipline or a department, which we often do at universities. The goal has always been everyone bring your expertise to a shared topic, but we don't have to align on the same theory or the same method. So I've learned a lot. I've been to really amazing, unique places, some for research, some for giving talks, and places that I think I wouldn't have otherwise. And what's so exciting about it at Kinsey is you're sort of at the center of a whole field in the world of people using different methods and asking different questions. And sometimes the questions are complicated by like laws in a particular country. So when we do multinational studies, some places you can't even ask the same questions. How do you protect your participants for being able to, share data? And sometimes they're different age groups, different race and ethnicity, different sexual orientations, and cutting through all of that diversity, and then what are the things that unite us in our pursuit of love and sex. So I've learned a lot. It's really been it's a remarkable position. It's a lot of fun.
It sounds like it. I mean, I love the model where you've got different areas of research coming into the same topic, different experts from different areas.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I do a lot on this podcast is I talk about men's kind of emotional, physical, mental, sexual development. What does the research say about men's either emotional or sexual development, or both, that most men were never taught and we are quietly suffering from as a result?
Oh, I think there's a lot. And you talk about this, John. You're so good at bringing this out, that there's a lot of issues that men are sometimes not given the freedoms or the encouragement to really get real about. And I think there's a lot, both in our sex lives and in our love lives, that we need to unpack, that men in particular really would do well to unpack. The one piece is that men are far more romantic, we see in the data, than people often think. In new relationships, men tend to say, "I love you" first, in heterosexual relationships. In breakups, men tend to suffer more in a breakup. They suffer longer in a breakup. They takes a longer amount of time for them to get over what's called post-relationship grief. One example, they're much more likely to commit suicide after a breakup than women. And
why do you think that is, that we have a harder time getting over the breakup? I've got a couple hypotheses.
Yeah, I'm curious what yours are. I have a few. I think I think one is biology. One is that, so on the one hand, males have the capacity to be more intrigued by variation, because in a strict evolutionary paradigm, you would say, well, men can reproduce at a faster rate, and they might have more interest in sort of quickly jumping to other partners. But the way evolution works is when the sexes have different pressures, then you expect a sex difference in a behavior. When they have the same pressure, you don't expect a sex difference. And one argument is that the pressure for pair bonding, for forming loving relationships for our ancestors, pair bonds evolved around 4 million years ago in humans, that was the same for men and women, as having mutual territory defense, mutual nest building, mutual raising of offspring. That was adaptive for both men and women. So, but with men having this other pressure, that there was a benefit for perhaps more variation at a faster clip, that means that you really want them to bond tightly in an evolutionary sense. Or maybe I shouldn't say you want them to, but it was adaptive to bond tightly, because if they start straying, you then undermine the pair bond relationship. So I think Mother Nature turned the dial a little far on men's pair bonds, that it hurts when we pull away. And there is evidence for both men and women, for instance, fMRI studies, that people going through a romantic rejection, if you look at their brain, they feel pain. They actually do feel physical pain. The brain looks remarkably like someone going through cocaine withdrawal when you go through a breakup. And
what all hits you in the amygdala, right?
Yeah, right. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. There's the amygdala, the striatum, there's a lot of parts of the brain, the ventral tegmental, all the dopamine stuff is going on, because often you have a breakup, you haven't stopped loving the person, so you still crave them, but you like have the absence of the thing you crave, like a drug. So, but for men in particular, I think that we often don't talk about the bonds. There's an expectation of like, okay, you can get over it, okay, you can move on. But this idea that men can love so deeply. And there's a lot of little parts of that we see in relationships, like cuddling, for instance. We don't ever talk about when couples cuddle, and this expectation, oh, men are always the big spoon, men are always this leader. Well, it turns out you talk to couples and the guys will say like, yeah, sometimes I just like when my female partner just, I want to be the little spoon tonight. I'm tired.
Just holds me.
Yeah. And we sometimes don't think of that enough. And then because we don't think and talk about it enough, men don't always feel they have grace. And then the other part that I think is we've got a lot of narratives about masculinity in relationships that that you talk about this, that are just so. I was just in Munich last week giving a talk, and someone asked me about the alpha wolf. I said, well, I'm an alpha. And I started chuckling because I said, the thing about being an alpha, there isn't an alpha male. They're like, what? What do you mean there's no alpha male? I said, there's a pair. There's an alpha pair, which works for me because I study relationships. And I said, there's an alpha pair, and it's a male and female, and the female.
You're talking about in the wolf pack specifically.
In a wolf pack in specific. Yeah. But it's true in a lot of different species. We have these ideas we pull from, then I've heard people say, well, you have to be like a lion. I'm like, well, in lions, the females do the heavy hunting, and we use sometimes the natural world, or we have these ideas of what masculinity or being a man can be in a relationship. And same for what being a woman should be in a relationship. And they're often just not true, but we're committed to this narrative because we think it's true. That's part of the reason I wanted to write this book, was like, let's just get more evidence and data in everyone's hands that we can cut through the noise.
Yeah. And thank you for doing so. I mean, from a psychological, from a cultural perspective, you nailed one of my answers. But the other part of it is that, male babies feel more intensely and more deeply than females. Which, so we feel, I think there's that myth that we don't feel much, or we don't feel as much as females, which is bullshit.
Yeah.
And, from an early age, we feel more. And then it's socialized out of us by the age of 4 or 5. And, and that's funny to me, because that's even before we get into groups of boys. And then, Niobe Way's research shows that as soon as we get into groups of boys, we start policing each other, we start, shutting each other down in terms of emotion. And so I think that one of the tenets of the man box culture is be stoic, don't feel. And we learn that really well, because we get mocked and humiliated if we show too much emotion or the wrong kind of emotion. And then the first experience we have of really being able to open up with someone else is in our first romantic relationship, typically, usually with someone of the other sex. And so then we have this relationship where, like, holy, this feels good. Like, I can actually share what I'm feeling with this other person. And ideally they can, empathize and validate and talk about it. But then when we lose that relationship, I think we go back to this place of not having anyone to talk to about that emotional level, and it just can crush us.
Yeah. Where's the safe haven that we want,
Yeah.
and particularly in long-term relationships? I often think of a partner as a co-pilot, and you want to be able to rely on your co-pilot. You want to feel safe. You want to know that you can trust them to take the wheel. You want to know that you, and when we don't have that in relationships, it can be such a challenge. I remember in one of our studies, we asked people the most pleasurable sex in their lives, and were the context of those experiences. And I used to work on hookup culture earlier in my career, so I thought, well, maybe people are doing more kind of exciting things and casual encounters. That's not what we found. The majority of both men and women said they were deriving the better sex, the most pleasurable sex, in contexts where they felt a love connection with a partner.
Yeah.
And that I think you're right. Yeah.
I've asked hundreds of men over the last 30 years, like, about their first sexual encounter, right? Like, what was your first sex like? Did you enjoy it? How does it compare with having sex in a relationship?
Yeah.
And I thought I was, initially I thought I was the only male that was like, I'm not really big on one night stands. Like, I mean, they're fun, they meet a physical need, but I always feel kind of, I don't know, a little bit gross, a little bit dirty, a little bit ashamed afterwards.
Yeah.
Not terrible, but I just realized it's not my cup of tea. And come to find out, I would say 95% of the men that I asked were exactly the same way, that they much preferred sex within a relationship.
Yeah.
And then, so I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. And not the narrative, to what you were saying earlier, right? Not the narrative that we hear so
the other thing, and so it's funny because you're coming at this from big data sets and I'm coming at it from, an N of 1 to 100.
Yeah. And we're aligning.
Yeah. And I remember I had a client recently who had a breakup, and he was really struggling with the breakup for, like 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. And I remember he told me he went out to hang out with a group of friends and they were drinking beer and watching some sports, and he kind of was vulnerable enough to bring this up in that setting. And, one of his male friends was just like, shit, just go out and get laid. That'll do, that'll heal you. That'll help you out. And it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe it's a nice distraction, but the depth of the response is a little bit lacking there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can, I mean, it's interesting. I often think the old adage, the best way to get over someone is to get under someone else. And there's a little bit of potential truth in terms of the neurochemistry of what's involved in sex and attachments and bonding. But you're right. It's not a particularly thoughtful long-term strategy, because you start to really, you could still be bonded to someone else. You're going through grief. I mean, that's the other thing with breakups that I think you and I are both saying, is we don't often talk enough about, like, there's real grief. There's it's in the brain, it's in the body, it's also social and cultural, and how you talk about it, how you so often we talk about, just move on, it's time, get back on the horse, meet someone else. You wouldn't say that if someone's brother died, right? But and what people are feeling when they're going through a breakup is sometimes like a death. They're mourning.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's exactly, or very similar. I mean, and I like the idea, or I appreciate the idea that the present loss brings up your past losses. Mm-hmm. So you could break up with someone that you were very close to, and it might bring up past grieving experiences, past losses of relationships, past deaths in your life. And I think it's important to hold on to that idea, because I think it gives weight and it gives perspective to what you might be going through emotionally. Yeah.
And I think in your world, you see it a lot, I'm sure, is that that's not something that we have to fear. That's the price of love. That's the price that we have the capacity as a species to love so deeply. Only 3% of mammals form pair bonds, 15% of primates. Wow. That we have the capacity to love so deeply, so intensely, sometimes lifelong. That's the price. When we lose it, it can be so painful, but it's not, I think that's a blessing in some ways, that we have that capacity.
Yeah, let me shift topics slightly here, because there was an excerpt from your book that I kind of fell in love with. So let me read this, if I may. A study was done which, quote, asked more than 200,000 people in 53 countries to rank mate preferences across a range of 23 categories of traits. Across the board, the top 5 preferred traits were intelligence, humor, honesty, kindness, and overall good looks. Women rated honesty and dependability higher than men. Men rated facial attractiveness higher than women did. And then later it says kindness is a quality that is universally desired in a partner. And then there was another piece that surprised me. The data are unequivocal about one other quality humans prefer in a mate. We seek partners who can lead us to self-expansion. Universally, we find growth beyond the self, new experiences, and new ways of thinking to be an alluring aspect of partnership. Can you comment on that? That last one in particular kind of blew me away, but I love the idea of kindness being a top trait we look for.
Yeah, and we do a big study in my lab called Singles in America with my colleague Dr. Amanda Gesselman and with our late colleague Helen Fisher, the anthropologist.
Oh yeah, Helen,
and
actually, Hall of Fame researcher.
Yeah, and John can see on the screen the gibbons behind me, the socially monogamous gibbons sculpture hanging behind me was from Helen. Her mom actually created them, and it was from her estate. So I get to remember her every day, my buddy.
Love it.
We found in our Singles in America study, we also ask about partner preferences. And in the last few years in particular, men and women, their number one trait that they want in a partner, these are singles, a sample of about 5,000 singles. Number one trait they want in a partner is someone they can trust and confide in. And it's boiled to the top for both men and women.
Makes
in terms,
sense.
and we give them 10 that they can rank order every year, and for 15 years. So there's a lot to be said about, and I think the pandemic has made that more obvious for a lot of people. That the interesting thing at the start of the pandemic, I had all these calls, journalists saying, do you think people are going to get divorced? They're going to get sick of their partner. There was this thought that everyone was going to fight too much being locked in the house. What we found in our studies was during COVID, sexual frequency did go down overall for most people. I think because there was a lot of stress going on. But most marriages, at least in a sample of marriages, did better. Actually, over 80% said that the pandemic strengthened their marriage in ways. And I think the reason why is one of the bigger arguments I make in the book, in The Intimate Animal, is that pair bonds evolved to weather uncertainty. And this was this big test of uncertainty for us. And then I'm gonna get to the answer to your question, John. But pair bonds allowed us to weather uncertainty. And we have these moments sometimes that test that. And what we really see is, oh, wow, I have a partner I can trust. I have a partner I can lean on, that we can get through bad things together. And through there, we start to see passion bubble up, and we feel deeper commitment bubble up. The same with, you can have kids with a partner. The first few months can be really horrific. And then you have a moment where you look at your partner and go, oh my gosh, we made life. Oh my gosh, you're a good partner. You're a good parent. Hopefully that's what you say. In cases when someone does say that, we know that can bring the couple even closer together. You see a new aspect of your partnership and your partner. So that trust and that confide in, I think I don't want to understate how important it is. It's so important for what we look for in our intimate relationships. And the other piece on that is that you want someone you can trust to take some risks with. So the point that you bring up on this expansion of self, what psychologists call expansion of self, when you want to see the world in new ways and try new things and experience new things, you want to get all that novelty, the excitement. Not some people get novelty by finding new partners. Some people take risks. Some people use alcohol and drugs. We crave novelty and sensation. The idea that you could do it with your partner, with a co-pilot that you can trust and confide in. So it's still about this issue of trust and connection with a partner that you can then take the risk. I'm comfortable going on the other side of the world with you. I'm comfortable trying something new sexually. I'm comfortable going to a new restaurant. I'm comfortable having a conversation that I feel really vulnerable with. Underlying all of that is when you have the safety net of someone you can trust, you can take more risks. You can experience more life. You can have more joy and experience. And we're driven for that. We're really driven for that, but we want that safety net.
Oh my God. My mind's exploding at what you're saying right now. I remember years ago, I did an interview in San Francisco, and there was a young woman watching. It was like an assistant, and she pulled me aside afterwards and she said, I graduated recently from Harvard. I just broke up with my boyfriend last year and I'm looking to get back into dating. Mm-hmm. And she said, do you have any advice on what to look for? And I thought, and I said, yeah, I think the number one thing in my mind to look for is someone who has a growth mindset around relationship skills.
Yeah.
Someone that's willing to learn and grow with you and find better ways to show up in relationship, because then you can deal with a lot.
Yeah.
And that stayed with me for a long time. But it's interesting. The other thing that comes to mind is my wife, who's a therapist, Jory Rose. She and I are working on a book for couples right now. And basically the through line is emotional safety is the pinnacle of what we're trying to shoot for in a happy, thriving relationship. And that incorporates all these things, right? I mean, like, humor doesn't exist if you don't feel emotionally safe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, you got to have kindness, you got to have honesty, but it's just fascinating to me how I play with this idea in my own relationship around emotional safety, and where I fall short sometimes because I'm still human.
Yeah, we all do.
So one of the things I wanted to ask, sorry, did you have something else there?
Oh, I wanted to say one more part that I'm excited for your book. and one part that influences some of my thinking, my Kinsey Institute colleague, Stephen Porges, has written about the polyvagal theory, and which you know. And in polyvagal theory, he talks about how the vagus nerve helps us interpret the environment. And for me, that's very evolutionary. It's about our nervous system, the evolution of our nervous system. And it's helpful for me to think about how our bodies interact with our environments. And when you're so right, John, like when we have any sense of threat, or and Steve would use the term threat. People talk about fight and flight and freeze and fawn, but any kind of threat in our environment is another way to think of that. That's not conducive to social behavior. It's not conducive to sociality. And it's particularly not conducive to mating psychology, for romantic connections, for sexual desire. One way I've often thought about it is I'll say, you'll never see two gazelle mating in front of a lion in the natural world.
Exactly. That's a great, yeah.
Or for us, you wouldn't kiss in a burning building, right? If we, now those maybe seem extreme, but actually sometimes the feeling of threat can be kind of low level and our nervous systems get turned on. And we have to really think about that. You need that safety, as you said it, to connect socially, intimately, sexually. We have to have that sense of a little bit of risk can be fun. I remember the first time I taught sexuality, a student said to me, "Professor, why is sex in a car so much more exciting than sex in my dorm?" And I thought, oh my gosh. First, I thought, speak for yourself. I'm over 6 foot tall.
Yeah, or how big is the car? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, well, there's novelty, but a little bit of risk. This idea that maybe you could get caught, maybe you're in a new place, that could be fun. But once you get into a threat physiology, that's really not good for connection and love and sex.
Yeah, it's funny. Jory and I have had this joke for a long time. We've been together 10 years, and she was really excited to find a partner who was an emotion geek. I mean, I've been studying emotions for 3 decades, and trying to solve myself, was the original impetus. But, I could easily say, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm feeling. And over time, she was like, you realize when you tell me how you feel, I get a little bit wet. Like I get sexually aroused. And I was like, huh. And so then it kind of evolved into a joke, like, hey, honey, I'm hungry. Are you wet? And then we started writing this book, and I'm trying to think of ways to get a man to read a book, which is a Herculean task, right? And I'm trying to think, okay, what does a man want in, which I would love your input on, but one of the things, or the things I think men want in relationship, I think they want sex, I think they want respect and appreciation, and I think they want to be left alone. They don't want to be nagged. Do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I guess there's other things. I mean, touch. I don't know. What else do you have?
Yeah, I think this idea that we want to be seen and heard by our partners, but particularly by our beloved. And that's, I mean, sometimes therapists or psychiatrists talk about being witnessed. We want someone to really hear us and see us and sort of acknowledge who we are. But also, you're right, touch. We want intimacy. And sometimes intimacy is kissing. Sometimes it's hugging. Yeah. Sometimes it's sexual behavior. But it's interesting. I'm thinking about your point about being nagged, and I think that also is this sort of frame of we want to feel like we can contribute. Men in particular want to feel like they can contribute to a relationship and are contributing. Men and women both do this, and I think that's where we have to think of it as being dyadic. What men often report to us is they want a relationship where they feel loved, but also that they can do loving. And that's why I'm quite critical of a lot of this sort of new AI chatbot relationship stuff, because I think that, does it really love me back? We want that. We look for that in our relationships. I want to love you. I want you to love me back. We want this two-way street. And the point of nagging is sometimes it feels like, oh, almost transactional. Like, oh, you're looking for things. Where's the love in there? Like, yeah, I'll take the garbage out, but you love me, right?
Well, and I think the nagging can be seen as a threat, as a low level threat,
Yeah.
which can shut you down.
Yeah, that you're not doing enough.
Yeah, and I think that can also bring up shame for a lot of men. But anyways, I'm trying to think of ways to kind of get men's buy into the book, and we came up with this idea of like a Likert scale for men's or for women's sexual arousal. So 1 to 5 scale with increasing droplets of water, they get bigger and more, and we're trying to come up with a name for it, and we came up with the name Vibe Rater. So on the vibrator, where does she stand on a 1 to 5 scale? Like if you practice this tool, you're at a 1. And as you keep going through the book, it'll get to 2, 3, 4, 5. The more of these you practice, the more emotionally safe she's going to feel, the more she's going to open up and relax. So anyways, that kind of cracked me up.
I like that. And you can get a vibrator.
Yeah. So back to, I don't know, being on point.
Yeah.
Why do you think, and you may or may not have thoughts on this, but why do you think so many men fall victim to some of these online influencers that push ideas about status, money, fame, physical strength, emotional detachment in terms of dating and in terms of finding the woman of your dreams?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think some are psychological processes that we understand, that sometimes our evolved mind or our evolved brains and mind are mismatched with the current environment and the amount of information we can get. And sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's just not knowing. I think that's why we write books, and that's why we do podcasts, and we try to help get more real information out. Even this point, I think that comes up a lot on this idea of, well, men have to be providers. And even that, there's nuance there in our evolutionary history that, this idea that men did more hunting of meat. Well, when you look at the anthropological evidence, there's this argument of man the hunter. There's also an argument called woman the gatherer. And it turns out that women historically brought way more calories into the home from gathering than men did from meat hunts. So they brought in high proteins and food, but actually women were really keeping families fed and survived. So this idea that men, they're the provider. Well, actually, women were the primary providers that kept families functioning throughout evolutionary history.
Yeah, because that's another rule of the man box, right? Be the provider. And I think there's some good to that, but I also see it work against us when we can't be the provider, when we're laid off, when we're fired.
Exactly, you nailed it.
Something, depression.
Exactly, hyper focused on it.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's tough. Or the men that admirably are stay-at-home dads. And that it can grate on them as well. And so these cultural norms are really deeply ingrained in our minds.
Yeah, that we have these rule book.
And I talk about them. There's some good and some bad to a lot of these, even like be self-reliant. To an extent, that's a great thing. If you go too far with it, it's a negative. If it's too far on the other side, it's a negative.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. And partly what we know is we'll see, we get this information. Now, historically, our ancestors relied on information from parents and family and tribe networks. And we get now information. We can go online, get more information than ever before. And sometimes it can be seducing, this idea that, I can be the provider, I can do this, and maybe it's my natural right to do it. And I think the narratives are a bit seducing for a lot of men, and that there's something to aspire to. Now, that said, we do know that in terms of mate choice studies and partner preferences, that in heterosexual contexts, men who have more resources are viewed as more attractive. They're, men who are able to provide in that sense are viewed as attractive. There's a reason you see a lot of relationships with celebrities or very wealthy people where, an older, very wealthy guy and a younger, very attractive woman. That's a somewhat consistent pattern that has to do with mating markets and what you bring to the table and all the cards that you have. The challenge that I think a lot of men have from some of our work is that the way the brain is taking in and processing what it views as available, your own role in that mating market. So we know from some studies that people tend to date aspirationally. So if you were to assign someone, for instance, a mate value score in a study based on all their characteristics, physical, psychological, resources, we tend to look for partners that have a 25% higher mate value than ourselves. So we aspirationally date. And the problem with that could be is sometimes we're just out of sync with reality of what we're looking for in a relationship. And then the other is a psychological phenomenon of it's somewhat similar to the paradox of choice, we have a sense that there's so many options when we're dating, or even when we're in relationships, that there's so many alternatives. That can really play a trick on our brain. So you hear these hot takes of like, don't settle in a relationship. I actually think that we hear too often, don't settle, and it's been distracting to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Not that because what does settling really mean? For me, it really means honing in on the reality of who's available, who's in your network. And I see over and over again, people are like, well, I went on a date and the person was great, but the way they laughed, or but the way they held their fork, or but because you only do that because you have a sense in the back of your mind, quite technically in your brain, you have a sense of an unlimited resource. So you have a sense that I can get on my phone when I walk out of this date and swipe through 2,000 more people, and someone there doesn't laugh like that and doesn't hold their fork like that. And what we forget is that a healthy relationship is someone who's doesn't necessarily never hits 100% of what you fantasize about of the perfect partner, but where you are comfortable with it and you learn and grow with each other. So I think we've gotten hyper focused on this idea that we should all have our list of 20, 30, 40 traits and just keep searching and you'll find that person. And that's just not consistent with reality.
Well, and it makes me think of those with an avoidant attachment style, right? That are more prone to that kind of thinking, I would imagine. Yeah. And we know that are overrepresented on the dating sites because they're the ones that are most likely to be like, screw it, I'm out when things go wrong or things get difficult.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't allow for us doing the work. If you have a solid partner, and I mean, my daughter just went through this. She just had a breakup with her boyfriend in college. And I was like, okay, so to what extent is this your avoidant attachment style? And to what extent is this actually the relationship? And I don't have an answer to this, but I would suggest you consider the question.
Yeah.
And this was a month or two before they broke up. So, I think she did, but I think it's a really important question. Is this are these patterns of behavior that I'm going to need to deal with at some point, regardless of the relationship that I'm in? Or is this actually the end of the relationship?
Yeah, I like that. And we just have some data. Funny, it just released this morning, just a few hours ago.
Awesome.
And you can tell me if you think this is nonsense, because I'm venturing into therapeutic territory. So we have some data on this idea for particularly for Gen Z, of this idea of self-expansion. And what we see in this data set now, with Match, a project we did with Match, they fund several studies in my lab, and people were reporting a very high level, particularly Gen Z, over 80% are interested in finding love, interested in dating, interested in a romantic relationship. But a huge number, over 50%, said that they didn't feel they were ready for a relationship. And I think that we're seeing people leaning in a little too hard to this idea that they have to work on themselves before they can find a relationship. That there's all this sort of work and self-actualization that needs to happen, not just for them, for yourself, but you also expect your potential dates to have worked on all their stuff. And I think we're forgetting that relationships can be the container to work on yourself. It's back to safety, what you were saying, and we were talking about earlier with safety. It's when you have a partner that you feel safe with that you can work on yourself and take risks and make mistakes and explore the world and explore yourself and explore sexuality. And but the idea that we go off on our own and do it in isolation and maybe with a therapist and then show up 100% ready and someone else shows up 100% ready, I think that which was never the goal of therapy, but I think people have leaning too focused on this idea that we all need to show up ready to date.
Ready. Yeah. Well, it seems like a focus on hyper individuality.
Yeah.
Right. It's all about me. And like my wife and I have been doing couples counseling for about 5 years, where I'll see the man individually, she sees the woman individually, or however that works out, and then together all four of us meet and do the couples work. And I love this model because it's so helpful to understand, this issue is primarily couples work that you guys need to do together. This issue is your work. You need to work on this. This issue is your work for the wife, for example. You need to work on this with Jory. Because, I really like that idea that there are some issues that I can work on by myself, and there's some issues that I can only work on with a partner in relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it seems to be missing that second piece.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so nice about that is it's also a reminder of that you can grow together. And it's helpful to have a guide, and it's helpful to have a sounding board to sort of navigate that process. But we're social animals. We don't grow in a dark closet and then just show up ready to bloom.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like attachment styles, I don't think we can really heal those outside of a relationship, for example.
Yeah.
So
I want to put that on a t-shirt.
Are you familiar with the book Till Stress Do Us Part?
No.
I don't want to. I think it's Emily Nagoski, but I can't remember. So I apologize if it's not Emily.
I know Emily's book. Oh, that's that. I'm blanking on the name, but I know her new book on stress. Yeah.
So it makes me wonder, like, what are your thoughts about stress and trauma and the pressures of modern life, and how do those overlay onto sexual satisfaction?
Yeah. There's a lot of ways that we've done some studies on like early childhood experiences, traumas, like ACE experiences, and how it can impact sexual function and later in life, particularly for males. We found early life traumas, it was associated with erectile dysfunctions later in life. We found some, it was with my colleague.
Is that the higher your score in ACEs, the more, what's the relationship there? Is it?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the study exactly. I'm picturing the chart and the image in my head. And so we found that men who had higher score on ACEs in terms of negative early childhood experiences, that there appeared to be something embodied in how it impacted sexual function later in life.
Interesting.
And one thought we had was that it could be, there's this whole argument about how trauma, if it's subdiaphragmatic trauma in particular, it might impact sexual organs.
Sorry, what was that word you used there?
Below the diaphragm, subdiaphragmatic.
Okay. So does that mean it shows up there, or it happened there physically?
Both. So, but there's this, and when it happens physically, so often if it's sexual trauma, that then you would expect
that makes
sexual
sense.
problems or reproductive problems. And there's this argument of, early on, there was an argument of, well, is it the same site? If you had sexual trauma, you kind of psychologically embody fear around psych or trauma with sexuality. But maybe it's also something about the nervous system and how we're kind of responding to where we feel things. So there's all these sort of debates about that are kind of technical about what people are experiencing. And what we found was any kind of trauma, not just sexual trauma, had these sexual function effects in men and erectile dysfunction later in life, which was interesting. So we thought, well, what could be going on there? And in the women's sample, we found some effects on vaginal lubrication. So when you look at sexual function in women, a couple of different measures you look at.
So lower on the vibrator.
Yeah, lower on your vibrator scale. And so we've looked at some of those as sort of really the honing in on trauma, and other folks have looked at these questions of how trauma in general, if it's embodied, how it can impact. And it could go back to this sort of polyvagal framework, that if you have trauma and it's embodied, and then you're kind of stuck in those threat responses, then how do you really psychologically open up for social connection and romantic and sexual connection? So the dysfunction, what we're calling dysfunction clinically, one shows up with distress over their ability to perform sexually, that it might actually really be that you're sort of stuck in that low-level threat response. So one of the arguments we're making. That brings up the bigger issue that you started with, John, that I really like, we could talk about a lot. And I'm increasingly starting to believe that when I think of us, putting on my hat as an evolutionary biologist, anthropologist, how do we respond to our social community? How do we respond to our biological or cultural environment, or physical environment, I mean, that I think I'm getting on board with this idea of this sort of generalized anxiety that people are feeling, that there's so much going on in the world in this particular moment that's so unique.
Pardon me for interrupting. Would you call that generalized anxiety, or to some extent trauma? I mean, I'm also thinking we're bordering, because of the state of the world, I feel like, this is a huge overstatement, but it feels like we're all a little bit traumatized.
Yeah.
I don't know what the right word or phrase is there.
No, I'm looking to you to put the right words. I caution you. I respect that I'm not the clinician.
It's a fear I have, so I want to name it as such.
Yeah, and I think I'm inclined to, yes, from what I know and my vantage point of how we're misaligned, and there's just so much, and It's a little bit, right? That we see more and more people are worried about the environment. They're worried about what's going on in Gaza. They're worried about politics. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about health, frankly. They're worried about relationships and what they're hearing on social media. And are they doing their own romantic and sexual life right? They're worried about reproduction. All of that adds up to these low-level threat responses physiologically. And I think what we could, does it roll up under a trauma response? I think that when we think of that, when we think that there's an accumulation effect of all this worry and concern to this low-level trauma, and maybe for some people high-level trauma, that suddenly for me, it's like I can see the world in a different way and start to see what's happening with our social behavior, what's happening with this loneliness epidemic, what's happening with our what I would call an intimacy crisis that we're experiencing. I think that helps me make sense of it, so that what that means is that our species is accumulating all those different pieces of stress. And there's no reason to think that we can't. There's no reason to think that that's not what's happening in the human brain. We know that we adaptively respond to environments. We have done it for millions of years. If our environment feels threatening and we sense that there's all this stress out there, we should in some way be responding. We should predict that we're responding. I think the challenge is that a lot of us don't like the way that our species is responding right now.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes me think of Dr. Faith Harper's, Faith wrote How to Unfuck Your Brain, along with 20 other books of similar titles. Kind of brilliant, actually. But she defines trauma as anything that disconnects us from a feeling of safety. And now that's a low bar for trauma. And I would say that's little t trauma. Yeah. But, I also like believe in the idea that the little t traumas can accumulate and create bigger t traumas. Yeah. And so why, with everything that's going on in the world, if our brain responds similarly to what's right in front of us versus what's on the news, then it's an easy bridge in my mind to make that jump. So thank you for that answer. So there's two more questions I have before we wrap up. What questions about sexuality are researchers most excited about right now that the public hasn't caught up to yet?
Oh my God, I'm gonna run up and down the hall again.
Yeah.
There's a lot, actually. There's a lot that we're studying here, and I think in the field is studying. Some are in the weeds. Some are questions about like asexuality and aromanticism, and are they really sexual orientations, or are we seeing what's going on with variation in what people desire? There is this big question about the sex recession, the so-called sex recession, that we're seeing different data sets. We see it in our data set, and at the Kinsey, several of our data sets, including Singles in America. There's been other Ad Health national data sets. It looks like people are having less frequent sex. Now, there's a couple of big questions there that all of sex research is starting to ask. One is, we're seeing less frequent sexual behavior in all these longitudinal and annual annual cross-sectional studies. Is that really a problem? So people are having less frequent sex, or are they less sexually satisfied? Are they happy with the quality of the sex in their life? If you're having sex twice less in a year, it's not necessarily good or bad if you're still satisfied, right? And that's quality over quantity in my book. And so there's that question on what's going on and its impact, but then also why it's happening. And there are arguments that I think 10 years ago, some people would be think we're a little woo-woo, but now as we're diving into the data, there's arguments about, is it estrogen disruptors in our environment that's impacting our sex steroids and our sexual desires? Is it the density with which we live? Is it the stress that you and I were just talking about that we're all experiencing? Is it social media? Is it distractions, in our everyday lives? Is it work? One of the arguments multinationally, for instance, was in certain countries that were first observing these declines in sexual activity and declines in fertility, it had to do with changing work culture. Like in China, they'll talk about 9-9-6. You work 9 to 9, 6 days a week. Well, that's not conducive for sex and love. And you're just too tired. And so I think this whole question of the sex recession and really unpacking, is it really there? Why is it there? What are the mechanisms? Are they biological, social, cultural, all of the above? That's a big thing for the field. That's what we're trying to unpack. And then the questions I'm interested in, the intersections of love and sex, I think we're thinking more and more about the context of sexual behavior. Be engaging in it on your own, solo, in a long-term partnership, in a short-term, casual, uncommitted encounter. or maybe a long-term but casual relationship, a transactional one like a sex worker. So I think understanding how these different contexts shape the experience of sexuality, the different relational contexts, that's also something that researchers are quite interested in.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I love the excitement. Can you answer one more question? Is that
of course?
Yeah. Time?
So I don't want to leave.
I know I could go on for hours, but if the average listener changed just one belief about sex or relationships based on current research, what belief do you think they should change that would most improve their well-being and or connection?
Oh gosh, I'm going to give a two-part answer. I know you asked for one. I'm sorry. I'm really bad at the one. John.
Do you think broadly?
Yeah, we did a study. We just published a study in the International Journal of Sexual Health with my colleagues Jessica Hilly and Amanda Gesselman, and it was on sex education. It's not a topic we write often about, but what we found in a national sample was that 44% of adults, this was single adults, a lot of the sex education literature is on adolescents. We looked at a sample of adults. 44% said if they had just had more sex education when they were younger, they would have healthier and happier relationships today. That's an awful lot. I mean, that's nearly 1 in 2 people saying, if I just had some accurate information. So I think for me, what that means is when we look at our relationships, what's the one thing we could do, or the myth we could dispel? It's really my friend, the late Dr. Ruth Westheimer, Dr. Ruth would talk about sexual literacy. And we just need more sexual literacy. We need to talk more openly and honestly and with facts and data about our sexual lives, because we know that that's associated with more consent, more pleasure, more satisfaction. All these good things come out when we have more facts and we have more evidence to guide how we think about our romantic and sexual life. So I think, maybe not fully answering the question, but my goal, my hope is that the more that we can talk honestly and investigate and be curious. Okay, now I'll give you a real answer. That we can be curious about our sexual lives on our own and with our partner. Being curious means finding answers, asking real questions and listening to the answers, reading a book, listening to a podcast, finding real, reputable information. So my hope for our sex lives is be curious. Be curious about yourself and about your partner and about your partnership. Those are 3 different things. Me, you, and us. Be curious about all of them. And curiosity is a powerful, powerful aphrodisiac.
I absolutely agree. And Dr. Justin Garcia, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And to the listener, if there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation, it's this: you're not broken, you're underinformed. So much of the shame, confusion, and quiet frustration around sex and relationships doesn't come from personal failure. It comes from outdated stories, incomplete education, and cultural myths that science has already outgrown. And that's why conversations like this mattered. If this episode challenged you or put language to something you felt but never quite named, do me a favor, share it with someone you trust, save it, or write a review. As always, this is Dr. John. This has been the Evolved Caveman.